I went into the mountains to disappear, not from the world necessarily, but from the weight of what I'd become in the weeks after my father's funeral. A hollow thing moving through rooms that suddenly felt too small, suffocating under the well-meaning words of people who couldn't possibly understand. The Cascade Wilderness in winter doesn't forgive weakness, and maybe that's what I needed. My father used to tell me stories about these peaks, about the old hunts his grandfather led through valleys so remote they didn't appear on any map. He spoke of the mountains the way other men spoke of cathedrals, with a reverence that bordered on fear. I wanted to know what he'd seen in all that silence, what truth hid beneath the snow that made him look past me sometimes, as if remembering something he could never quite name. So I packed my gear, told no one where I was going, and drove until the roads turned to gravel, then to nothing at all. The trailhead was abandoned when I arrived, the parking area buried under fresh powder that sparkled like crushed diamonds in the weak morning light. I shouldered my pack and started walking, my breath forming clouds that hung in the frozen air before dissolving into the vastness around me. The forest swallowed me within minutes. Ancient pines rising like pillars in some forgotten temple, their branches heavy with snow that muffled every sound until I could hear nothing but my own footsteps and the blood pulsing in my ears. There's a particular quality to winter silence in the deep woods, a thickness that feels almost physical, as if you're moving through layers of accumulated time rather than simple air. I'd come seeking solitude, seeking answers to questions I couldn't articulate, but with each mile the isolation transformed into something else entirely, something watchful. The grief I'd been carrying shifted in my chest, growing heavier and stranger, like it was responding to the landscape itself, recognizing something in these mountains that I couldn't yet see. By the time I made camp that first night, I'd traveled deeper than I'd intended, driven by a compulsion I didn't fully understand. The map said I was miles from any established trail, but some part of me, the part that shared my father's blood perhaps, knew exactly where I needed to go. I set up my tent in a small clearing, surrounded by trees so old their trunks were wider than my outstretched arms, their bark scarred and weathered by centuries of storms. The temperature was dropping fast, the kind of cold that reaches past your layers and settles in your bones. But I barely noticed. I was thinking about my father's last words to me, spoken in the hospital room, that smelled of antiseptic and ending things. He'd gripped my hand with surprising strength and said, "The mountains remember us, even when we forget them." I hadn't understood then. I'd thought it was the morphine talking, the dying rambles of a mind letting go. But standing there in that clearing, watching darkness pool between the trees like spilled ink, I felt the first tremor of recognition, the sense that I was walking into a story that had been waiting for me long before I knew I needed to find it. I didn't know then that within hours, everything I thought I understood about the world would crack open like ice beneath impossible weight. I didn't know that my camera would capture something that would haunt me for the rest of my life, or that I'd come face to face with a truth so old and strange that language fails around its edges. All I knew, standing in that frozen clearing with night pressing in from all sides, was that I wasn't alone. The forest was holding its breath, and somewhere out there in the darkness, something was holding its breath too, waiting for me to take one more step into the place where the world I knew ended, and something else, something ancient and watching, began. I woke before dawn to a silence so complete it felt like erasure. Not the peaceful quiet of deep wilderness, but an absence, as if every living thing had fled or fallen still in the presence of something that commanded submission. My breath came shallow and quick, fogging in the frigid air of the tent, and I lay there listening with an intensity that made my skull ache. Nothing. No wind stirring the branches, no distant call of owls or the soft cascade of snow sliding from overladen boughs. The forest had become a held breath, a pause between heartbeats, and I was caught inside it. When I finally Forced myself to unzip the tent. The morning light revealed the first sign, a single footprint in the fresh snow that had fallen during the night. It was massive, easily twice the length of my own boot, pressed deep into the powder with a clarity that spoke of tremendous weight. The impression showed 5 distinct toes, almost human in configuration, but elongated and tipped with what looked like claw marks. I crouched beside it, my gloved hand hovering above the indentation, not quite daring to touch. The print was so fresh that the edges were still crisp and sharp, unmelted by sun or disturbed by wind. Whatever had made it had passed within feet of my tent while I slept, moving through the darkness with a silence that terrified me more than any sound could have. I told myself it was a bear. Some massive grizzly that should have been hibernating but had wandered out in confusion, its proportions distorted by the snow and my own fear-sharpened imagination. But even as I thought it, I knew the lie for what it was. The print was wrong for a bear, too deliberate, too purposeful in its shape. I pulled out my phone to photograph it, hand shaking despite the insulated gloves, but the device was dead, frozen solid, despite the battery pack I'd kept in my sleeping bag. So I used my camera instead, framing the footprint against my boot for scale, trying to capture the impossible dimensions of what I was seeing. As I stood and scanned the tree line, I found more prints leading away from camp, each one spaced impossibly far apart, suggesting a stride length that made my stomach clench. They led directly to a cluster of ancient pines, about 50 yards distant, where the bark had been stripped from the trees at a height no bear could reach. Long vertical gouges ran down the exposed wood, some reaching 12 feet up the trunks, as if something had stood on its hind legs and reached up in a gesture that felt less like marking territory and more like leaving a message. The stripped bark lay in pale curls on the snow below, stark against the white like scattered bones. I approached slowly, my boots crunching too loud in the suffocating silence, and when I reached the trees, I saw that the gouges weren't random. They formed patterns, deliberate strokes that might have been coincidence, but felt like language from something that existed before language was needed. The rational part of my mind was screaming at me to pack up and hike out immediately, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever had visited my camp in the darkness. But a deeper instinct, something inherited perhaps from my father and his father before him, held me rooted in place. This was why I'd come, wasn't it? To find what my father had known but never named, to understand the reverence and fear that had lived in his eyes when he spoke of these mountains. The stripped trees stood like sentinels, marking a boundary I couldn't see but could somehow feel. A threshold between the world I knew and something older, something that remembered when humans were still learning to walk upright and name their fears. I thought of the stories my father told on winter nights, tales his grandfather had passed down about the old hunters who would sometimes return from the mountains changed, speaking in hushed voices about shapes seen in blizzards and eyes that watched from impossible heights. I dismissed them as folklore, the kind of stories people tell to make sense of the wilderness that dwarfed them. Standing there among the marked trees, I felt the arrogance of that dismissal like a physical weight. These weren't stories to comfort or explain. They were warnings, breadcrumbs left by those who'd walked this path before me, and wanted others to know what waited in the deep places where maps ended and something else began. I forced myself to continue up the trail, following the massive prints, because turning back felt like betraying not just my purpose, but some unspoken covenant with my father's memory. The tracks led higher into the mountains, winding through valleys so pristine they seemed untouched since the world's creation. Hours passed in that suffocating silence, the sun climbing higher but offering no warmth, only a brittle light that made the snow gleam like frosted glass. My legs burned with exhaustion, my lungs aching in the thin air, but I pushed forward, driven by something beyond mere curiosity. Around midday, I crested a ridge and found what stopped me cold, and Abandoned camp, nestled in a hollow between two massive granite outcroppings. A tent still stood, half collapsed under accumulated snow, its fabric torn and flapping weakly in a wind I couldn't feel. Supplies were scattered across the clearing, as if someone had left in a hurry or had their camp ransacked by something searching with desperate urgency. A cooking stove lay overturned, a sleeping bag pulled halfway from the tent and frozen solid, and most disturbing of all, a journal lying open on a flat rock, its pages riffling in that phantom wind, like something trying to speak. I approached with the caution of someone entering a tomb, knowing instinctively that whoever had made this camp was gone and wouldn't be coming back. The journal's pages were filled with sketches, frantic, obsessive drawings of a figure that towered over the surrounding landscape, its proportions somehow wrong and right simultaneously, its face caught between animal and something heartbreakingly close to human. The final entry was dated just 3 days. Prior, the handwriting deteriorating from careful notation to desperate scrawl, the last words written in letters so large and shaky they nearly tore through the paper. "It knows I'm watching." I knelt beside the journal, my hands trembling as I turned the pages backward through the descent into obsession. The early entries were methodical. Coordinates, weather observations, wildlife sightings recorded with the precision of someone conducting research. But gradually the tone shifted, the handwriting growing more erratic as the sketches multiplied. Page after page showed the same figure from different angles and distances, always standing at the edge of clearings or half hidden among trees, always watching. What disturbed me most wasn't the drawings themselves, but the details that emerged through repetition, the unmistakable intelligence in the eyes, the posture that suggested not aggression but patience, as if the creature was waiting for something the observer couldn't quite grasp. In the margins, questions appeared in tiny script, phrases like "does it sleep" and "why always upwind," and most chilling of all, "I think it's showing me something." The final sketches showed the figure closer, its features rendered with shaking but meticulous care, and I realized with a jolt that ran through my entire body that I recognized the location in the background, the frozen lake, the same lake where I'd planned to camp tonight less than 2 miles further up the trail. I searched the abandoned camp for any sign of what had happened to its occupant, finding only fragments that told an incomplete story. A backpack hung from a tree branch, its contents rifled through, but nothing obviously taken. Food pouches still sealed, expensive camera equipment left behind, even a wallet containing cash and identification for someone whose name I forced myself not to read, not wanting to make this real in that particular way. What kind of fear makes a person abandon hundreds of dollars of gear and flee into winter wilderness? I found tracks leading away from camp, human boot prints running alongside those massive 5-toed impressions, the two sets parallel for perhaps 30 yards before the human tracks simply stopped at the base of a cliff face. No signs of a struggle, no blood in the snow, just an ending as abrupt and inexplicable as a sentence cut mid-word. I stood at that spot for a long time, staring at the last boot print as if intensity of focus could reveal what had happened next. Had the person climbed? Been taken? Simply vanished into the vertical stone like a ghost, returning to the mountain that spawned it? The journal offered no answers, only that final declaration of being seen, of the terrible intimacy of having something vast and unknowable turn its full attention upon you. The rational choice would have been to take the journal, hike back down, and report the abandoned camp to authorities who could conduct a proper search. But rationality felt like a luxury from another life, a set of rules that applied to the world below but held no weight in this high place where the air itself seemed different, older, thick with presence. I carefully closed the journal and placed it back on the rock, weighting it down with a stone so it wouldn't blow away, a gesture that felt like maintaining a shrine or honoring the dead. Something in me understood that this camp was meant to be found, that I was following a path laid out long before I decided to come here, perhaps before I was born. My father's face came to me then, not as he'd been at the end, diminished by illness and shadow, but as I remembered him from childhood, standing at the edge of our property at dusk, staring toward these mountains with an expression I'd never been able to name. Loss and longing and recognition all mingled together, as if he was remembering something that hadn't happened yet, or mourning someone he'd never met. I'd asked him once what he was looking at, and he'd turned to me with eyes that seemed to see past my question to something I was too young to understand. The places where the world is still dreaming, he'd said, and I'd dismissed it as the kind of poetic nonsense adults sometimes spoke when they didn't want to give real answers. Standing in that abandoned camp with those final words echoing in my mind, I felt the first crack in the wall I'd built around my grief. I'd come to these mountains thinking I was searching for solitude, for space to process loss without the suffocating sympathy of others. But beneath that conscious intention lay something deeper and more desperate, the need to find what my father had known, to walk where he'd walked in spirit if not in body, to understand the sacred thing that had lived in his silence, the creature in the sketches, this presence that moved through the forest, leaving signs like a language I was only beginning to learn, wasn't separate from that search. It was the search, the answer and the question bound together, the thing my father had revered and feared in equal measure. I picked up my pack with hands that no longer shook, feeling a strange calm settle over me like snow. Whatever had happened to the journal's author, whatever waited at the frozen lake ahead, I would meet it, not with the arrogance of someone seeking to capture or explain, but with the humility of someone finally ready to witness what he'd inherited but never acknowledged, a covenant with the mystery itself. I reached the frozen lake as the sun touched the horizon, painting the ice in shades of copper and dying gold that made the whole basin look like the interior of some ancient cathedral lit by failing candles. The silence here was different from the forest, not an absence of sound, but a presence of its own, thick and watchful, as if the air had crystallized into something that could observe. I worked quickly to set up my tent on a small rise above the shore, my hands efficient despite the cold, muscle memory taking over while my mind circled around what I'd found at the abandoned camp. The journal's sketches had burned themselves into my thoughts, and I caught myself glancing toward the tree line between each task, searching for the silhouette I both dreaded and somehow expected to see. As I hammered in the final stake, the sound of metal striking frozen earth seemed obscene in that holy quiet, each impact an intrusion that made me wince. The temperature was dropping rapidly with the sun's descent, my breath forming clouds that hung suspended before my face like visible ghosts of words I couldn't speak. I stood and turned toward the lake, drawn by something I couldn't name, and that's when I heard it. A sound that bypassed my ears and spoke directly to something older living in my bones, a deep resonant call that vibrated through my chest cavity and made my heart stutter in primal recognition. The call came again, rolling across the frozen lake like thunder contained and given voice, a sound that predated language but carried meaning nonetheless. Loneliness and power and terrible, ancient grief all braided together in frequencies that human throats could never produce. I felt my knees weaken, not from fear exactly, but from the sheer weight of a presence that sound conveyed, the way it announced something immense and impossibly old, moving through a world it had witnessed long before my ancestors learned to make fire. My father's words came back to me, that phrase about places where the world is still dreaming, and I understood with sudden clarity that I was hearing the dream speak, that this sound was what the earth itself might cry out if given voice. It stirred something in my blood that I'd never known was sleeping there, a response coded into my cells by generations who had heard this call and survived, who had learned to recognize it not as threat but as testament, proof that the world contained depths that civilization could never fully illuminate or tame. I found myself moving toward the lake's edge without deciding to walk, my legs carrying me forward while my rational mind watched from some distant observatory, noting but not controlling. The third call came from closer, somewhere beyond the far shore, where the pines grew thick and shadows pooled like spilled ink. Between the trees. This time I felt it not just in my chest but in my throat, as if my body wanted to answer, to add my own voice to that primordial conversation. Tears streamed down my face, freezing in the corners of my eyes, and I realized I was weeping without sadness, crying the way mountains might cry when ice finally breaks in spring. Release of something held too long, under impossible pressure. This was what I'd come here seeking without knowing its name, this sound that gave form to the grief I'd been unable to voice since my father's death, the howl that lived beneath words, where loss becomes too vast for human language to hold. In my mind's eye, I saw him again as he'd been in those last days, his hand gripping mine with surprising strength, his mouth forming words I'd had to lean close to hear. "Listen to what can't be heard," he'd whispered, and I'd nodded as if I understood, but I'd been lying, comforting him with false comprehension, while inside I'd felt only the hollow ache of approaching absence. Standing at that frozen lake's edge with the call still reverberating through my body, I finally heard what he'd been trying to give me. Not an explanation, but an invitation. Not answers, but the recognition that some questions are themselves the destination. The sound came once more, softer now, almost gentle, and in its fading echo I heard not threat but kinship, the acknowledgement that passes between those who have known loss too deep for consolation. My hand moved to my chest without conscious thought, pressing against my heart as if to hold the sound inside, to let it reverberate through all the hollow spaces grief had carved. The lake stretched before me like a mirror between worlds, its frozen surface catching the last light, and I knew with certainty that what called from the darkening trees was coming, that the watching was ending and the meeting beginning, that I was about to stand face to face with the thing my father had revered, and that nothing I'd been before this moment would survive the encounter unchanged. I fumbled for my camera with numb fingers, some instinct deeper than fear, driving me to document what was coming, to capture proof, even as another part of me recognized that proof was irrelevant, that this moment existed beyond the realm of things that could be verified or shared. The weight of the camera in my hands felt both absurd and necessary, talisman of the rational world I was leaving behind, and I raised it to my eye as the sun dropped below the mountain peaks, painting the sky in wounds of crimson and purple that bled across the clouds. Through the viewfinder, the world became framed and distant, a story I was watching rather than inhabiting, and perhaps that thin barrier of glass and technology was what allowed me to keep looking when every animal instinct screamed to run. I pressed record and swept the lens across the tree line, capturing the darkening pines and the mist rising from the frozen lake, my breath fogging the eyepiece as I panned slowly toward where the call had originated. The last sunlight caught the snow in golden fire, each crystal burning with cold radiance, and for several heartbeats I saw only trees and shadows, the ordinary architecture of wilderness at dusk. Then the shadows moved. No, one shadow moved, separating itself from the vertical darkness between the pines with a fluidity that seemed impossible for something so massive, and through my camera lens I watched it step into definition. The silhouette stood motionless at the forest's edge, framed by trees that suddenly seemed small, their trunks reduced to saplings by proximity to that towering form. My hands began shaking violently, the camera jerking in my grip, but I couldn't lower it, couldn't break the spell of that focused vision even as my heart hammered against my ribs, like something trying to break free from a cage it had suddenly recognized as prison. Through the lens, I could see it was too large to be a bear, too vertical, too deliberately still in a way that spoke of consciousness rather than instinct, of choice rather than impulse. It stood over 8 feet, tall even in its relaxed posture, and I had the terrible sense that it could unfold to even greater height if it wished, that what I saw was its version of making itself small, of trying not to overwhelm. The dying light caught its eyes, and they flared amber in my viewfinder, 2 coals of awareness that reflected the sun's last fire and seemed to burn with their own interior flame. Those eyes found me across the frozen expanse, locked onto the lens with an intensity that collapsed the distance between us, and I felt the gaze like a physical touch, like fingers pressing against the most vulnerable parts of my mind. My rational self tried to catalogue what I was seeing, the breadth of shoulders, the length of arms, the silver-white fur that caught the fading light like frost. But rationality was failing, dissolving under the weight of presence that radiated from that motionless figure. This was no animal, or rather it was more than animal, something that occupied a space between categories my civilization had worked centuries to. They keep separate. I zoomed in with trembling hands, the automatic focus hunting across that massive form, and details emerged that made my breath catch in my throat. The intelligent set of the head, the human-like posture, the way it held itself with a dignity that seemed to mock the very concept of the word creature I'd been using to contain it. In the viewfinder's frame, I could see the rise and fall of its chest, the breath visible in silver clouds that hung before it like spirits being exhaled, and the recognition that it breathed, that it lived with the same fundamental processes that sustained me, made it simultaneously more real and more impossible. The camera's battery indicator blinked in the corner of my vision, a mundane detail that seemed absurd in this moment, and I thought how strange it was that I could worry about digital storage while watching a legend step out of time. Terror gripped me then with such force that I nearly dropped the camera, my fingers spasming around its weight as my body finally caught up to what my eyes had been reporting. Every documentary I'd ever seen about predators flashed through my mind, the freeze response, the prey stillness that sometimes preceded death, and I realized I'd become stone without choosing it, rooted to the frozen ground like the trees that surrounded us. But underneath the fear ran a current of something else, something that felt like recognition, as if some ancient part of my brain was responding not with alarm, but with a terrible homecoming, a sense of, yes, of course, I have always known you were here. The creature remained motionless in the tree line, and I understood with sudden certainty that it was watching me watch it. The creature stepped forward, and the movement shattered the frozen tableau that had held us both suspended in that moment of mutual observation. Its foot came down on the snow-covered ground with a weight I could feel through the earth, a tremor that traveled up through my boots and into my bones, announcing mass and solidity that made it undeniably real. Through my camera lens, I watched it emerge fully from the tree line, stepping into the clearing with a deliberate slowness that suggested not caution but consideration, as if it was choosing each movement to minimize threat, to communicate intention through the language of gesture that predated words. The silver-white fur that covered its body caught the last rays of dying sunlight and seemed to glow from within, each hair distinct and shimmering like frost-touched grass in dawn light. And I could see now the powerful architecture of muscle beneath that coat, the way its shoulders rolled with each step, the coiled strength in its legs that suggested it could cover the distance between us in seconds, if it chose. But it wasn't choosing speed, wasn't rushing, and that restraint was somehow more terrifying than any charge would have been, because it demonstrated control, showed me I was not witnessing animal impulse, but conscious decision. The camera continued recording, though my hands shook so badly the image must have been nearly unusable. A palsy of fear and awe that I couldn't suppress no matter how I tried to steady myself. Its face emerged from shadow as it walked, and I saw features that scrambled my understanding of taxonomy. The broad, flat nose, the heavy brow ridge, the set of the jaw that was neither human nor ape, but something that existed in the troubling space between, suggesting evolutionary paths my species had declared impossible. It stopped at the frozen lake's edge, perhaps 20 feet from where I stood rooted beside my half-erected tent, and for several heartbeats we simply regarded each other across that narrow divide of ice and air. Through the viewfinder, I could see its chest rising and falling with deep, regular breaths, could see the intelligence moving behind those amber eyes as it studied me with an intensity that felt like being read, like every defense and pretense was being stripped away by that ancient gaze. The terror that gripped me began shifting, transforming into something more complex, as the moments stretched and the creature made no move to attack, showed no aggression in its posture or bearing. Instead, it stood with a stillness that felt almost ceremonial, holding itself in a way that reminded me disturbingly of how my father used to stand at my mother's grave, upright and solid, but carrying an invisible weight that bowed something deeper than spine. The dying light painted us both. In shades of purple and gold, two figures at the edge of a frozen lake, in the middle of wilderness so remote that our presence here felt like trespass against some older claim. I lowered the camera slightly, some instinct telling me that this moment required my full attention without the mediation of technology, that whatever was happening needed to be witnessed with more than mechanical eyes. The creature's head tilted fractionally as I did this, tracking the movement, and I swear I saw something like approval flicker across those strange features, a recognition that I'd made the right choice. Then it moved again, and I watched through a mixture of naked eye and occasional glances at my camera's screen as it approached the lake's frozen surface with steps that seemed weighted with purpose. It stopped at the very edge where ice met shore, and slowly, with a deliberacy that transformed the gesture into ritual, lowered itself to one knee. The movement was so unexpected, so fundamentally non-threatening, that my fear receded another degree, replaced by a bewildered fascination that overrode survival instinct. From this new position, it was still massive, still radiated a physical power that could end me without effort. But the posture itself spoke a language I understood in my bones: supplication, reverence, grief. It extended one enormous hand, fingers spread wide, and pressed, its palm flat against the ice's surface, and I could see even from this distance how the fur on that hand was worn thin, how the gesture had the quality of something done many times before, a ritual repeated across seasons or years. The creature's head bowed forward until its forehead nearly touched the ice, and from deep within its chest came a sound that froze my blood, not from terror this time, but from recognition. It was the same call I'd heard earlier, but transformed, brought down from that resonant announcement into something quieter and infinitely more desolate, a keening that vibrated through the twilight air and seemed to carry the weight of immeasurable loss. I felt something crack open inside my chest as that mournful sound washed over me, felt the carefully constructed walls I'd built against my own grief shudder and begin to crumble. Through my camera's microphone, I knew this was being recorded, this impossible moment. But I also knew that no playback could capture what I was feeling as I stood witness to this creature's sorrow. The sound it made was not animal, or was animal in the way that human grief is animal, stripped of language and civilization and reduced to the pure expression of pain that transcends species. My eyes burned with tears that had nothing to do with the cold wind, tears I'd been holding back for months, and as that haunting call echoed across the frozen lake, I felt my father's absence as a physical wound all over again. The Yeti, because what else could I call it now, this legend made flesh, remained motionless with its hand pressed to ice and its head bowed in mourning. And I understood with a clarity that bypassed rational thought that this place was sacred, that this lake and these mountains held something that drew both of us here, It was guarding this threshold, this thin place, where the veil between worlds grew gossamer and transparent, and it recognized in me another soul carrying the weight of unfinished goodbye, another pilgrim drawn to the edge of mystery by the gravity of loss. The creature lifted its head from the ice and turned those amber eyes directly toward me, and in that moment I felt seen in a way I hadn't allowed myself to be seen since my father's funeral. The intelligence in that gaze was undeniable and deeply unsettling, carrying a knowing that seemed to pierce through the careful performance I'd been maintaining for months. The assurances to family that I was handling things fine, the return to work after the acceptable mourning period, the practiced smile that kept people from asking difficult questions. Here in this frozen wilderness, with twilight bleeding into darkness, standing before this impossible being, I couldn't maintain those defenses, couldn't pretend that I'd come to these mountains for simple solitude or adventure. The Yeti remained kneeling at the ice's edge, one massive hand still pressed against the frozen surface, but its attention was fully focused on me now, with an intensity that felt like a question being asked without words. My throat tightened as I realized what it was waiting for. What? This moment was demanding of me, and the recognition sent a spike of panic through my chest because I didn't know if I could give what was being asked. My father had spoken of these mountains with a reverence I'd always attributed to nostalgia, to his Cherokee grandmother's stories and the romantic notion of ancestral connection. He'd told me once that there were places where the world was thin, where the boundary between what we know and what we've forgotten became permeable, and that such places demanded respect and sometimes sacrifice. I'd nodded and smiled and thought it was beautiful mythology, the kind of spiritual poetry that gave meaning to empty wilderness, never believing there was literal truth beneath the metaphor. But standing here watching this creature mourn at a frozen lake's edge, feeling the weight of its attention and the echo of its grief resonating with my own, I understood that my father hadn't been speaking in metaphors at all. He'd been trying to tell me something essential about the nature of loss and memory, and the places where the dead remain somehow present, trying to prepare me for a truth I wasn't ready to hear. The camera in my hands suddenly felt obscene, a technological barrier between myself and something that required full participation, and with trembling fingers I lowered it completely, letting it hang from the strap around my neck. The Yeti's eyes tracked this movement, and something shifted in its posture, a subtle relaxation that suggested approval, or perhaps relief. It withdrew its hand from the ice, slowly, reverently, and then, with that same deliberate care, it extended that massive palm toward me, not reaching across the distance between us, but offering, presenting, inviting. The gesture was so clearly intentional, so obviously communicative, that my rational mind struggled to process it even as my body understood on some deeper level. This was the choice point, the moment where I either retreated into the safety of observer status and remained fundamentally unchanged, or I stepped forward into participation and accepted whatever transformation that might bring. My legs felt weak, and my heart hammered against my ribs as I considered the implications, the very real physical danger of approaching a creature that could kill me without effort, but also the deeper risk of opening myself to the grief I'd been running from since the moment I'd watched them lower my father's casket into frozen ground. The tears on my face had frozen in the dropping temperature, small points of ice against my cheeks, and my breath came in visible clouds that hung in the air between us like unanswered questions. I took a step forward, then another, my boots crunching on snow that sounded deafening in the silence that had fallen over the clearing. The Yeti remained absolutely still as I approached, maintaining that kneeling posture with its hand extended, and I could see now the incredible detail of its form, the individual strands of silver-white fur, the weathered texture of its palm, the ancient patience in its eyes. When I was close enough to feel the heat, radiating from its massive body, close enough that it could reach out and grab me before I could even think to run. I dropped to my knees on the frozen shore. My hand looked absurdly small and fragile as I raised it, trembling so badly I could barely control the movement, and pressed my palm against the ice beside where the creature's hand had rested moments before. The cold burned through my glove instantly, a sharp pain that anchored me completely in my body, and from somewhere deep inside me a sound emerged that I didn't recognize as my own voice, a raw, broken cry that carried my father's name, and all the words I'd never said, and the crushing weight of absence that I'd been trying to outrun by coming to these mountains. The Yeti's response was immediate and overwhelming. It placed its other hand on the ice beside mine and released a sound that seemed to come from the very bedrock beneath us, a resonance that vibrated through the frozen lake and up through my bones until my entire body became a tuning fork for its grief. The sound wasn't animal, wasn't human, but something that existed in the space between, a vocalization that carried the weight of centuries and spoke to something older than language in my DNA. I felt my father's presence then with such vivid intensity that I gasped, not as memory or imagination, but as something more tangible, as if the ice beneath. Our hands had become a bridge between worlds, and he was standing just on the other side, reaching back toward me. The creature's eyes never left mine as it sang this mournful note, and I understood with sudden clarity that this being was not simply a remnant of prehistoric times surviving in isolation, but a guardian of thresholds, a keeper of the spaces where love doesn't end, but transforms into something we lack the vocabulary to name. My own voice joined its call without conscious decision, a harmony of loss that merged with the Yeti's ancient grief. And together we created something that the mountains seemed to recognize and hold. The tears flowed freely now, unfrozen by the heat of my emotion, and I stopped trying to control the sobbing that racked my body, stopped performing strength or acceptance, or any of the roles I'd been playing since my father's death. The rational part of my mind that had spent months constructing elaborate defenses against feeling tried desperately to reassert control, whispering that I was experiencing hypothermia-induced hallucination or oxygen deprivation or some stress-induced break with reality that would require years of therapy to unpack. But that voice sounded hollow and distant compared to the truth resonating through my chest, the undeniable reality of connection happening in this frozen clearing as darkness completed its claim on the sky. The Yeti slowly lifted its hand from the ice and placed it over its chest, fingers spreading across its massive sternum, and the gesture was so recognizable, so heartbreakingly familiar, that I released another broken sound. My father used to do the same thing when he spoke of his grandmother, of the old ways and the stories she told him, pressing his hand to his heart as if checking that the memories remained safely stored there. This creature was showing me the same thing, demonstrating that grief wasn't something to be overcome or processed or moved beyond, but something to be carried with honor in the deepest part of yourself, where it could transform from pain into sacred responsibility. The land remembered everything that had happened on it, my father had told me once, and certain beings were chosen or cursed to carry that remembrance forward, to hold the grief of all those who had loved and lost on the boundary spaces where the veil grew thin. I'd thought he was speaking philosophically, offering a comfort through poetic imagery, but watching this ancient guardian demonstrate the weight of its burden, I realized he'd been describing literal truth. The Yeti rose slowly to its full towering height, and instinctively I scrambled backward on the ice, my body's survival instinct finally overriding the strange communion we'd shared. But the creature made no move toward me, simply stood at the lake's edge with its head tilted upward toward the darkening sky, and began another vocalization. This one different, less mournful, carrying a note that felt like release, or perhaps blessing. Snow began to fall in large, soft flakes that caught the last traces of light, and in that moment I experienced a shift in perception so fundamental that I knew I would spend the rest of my life trying to find words adequate to describe it. The boundary between myself and the world around me seemed to dissolve, and I felt the mountains not as environment but as presence, felt the accumulated weight of every human who had ever walked these valleys. In carrying their joy and sorrow, felt my father among them now, part of something vast and ongoing. The Yeti was showing me that death wasn't ending, but transformation, that my father hadn't vanished, but joined the consciousness of this place he'd revered, and that my grief was actually evidence of connection that transcended physical presence. The creature lowered its gaze back to me, and in its amber eyes I saw acknowledgement, recognition that I had received what I came seeking, even though I hadn't known what question I was asking. As I knelt there on the ice with my hands still pressed against the frozen surface and snow gathering on my shoulders, the full implications crashed through me. With devastating clarity, I would return to a world that couldn't accommodate this truth, would try to explain what happened here to people who would see only footage of shadows and hear only the grief-stricken rambling of a man who went into the mountains looking for answers his father never gave him. The evidence I'd gathered would be dismissed as misidentification, the emotional experience attributed to isolation and unprocessed trauma, and the profound shift in my understanding of reality would become something I'd learn to speak about carefully, if at all. But the truth would remain undeniable in my body, in the way I moved through the world, in the relationship I now had with my father's absence that was no longer absence at all, but presence in a different form. The Yeti had given me what I needed most without my knowing to ask for it. Not proof of the supernatural or validation of indigenous wisdom or even the comfort of believing in something beyond death, but the permission to feel the full magnitude of my loss without fear that it would destroy me. Grief this large, this sacred, wasn't a problem to be solved but a responsibility to be honored. And these mountains where my ancestors once walked would hold that truth long after I returned to the world of explanations and reasonable doubt. The Yeti held my gaze for several heartbeats longer, and in that exchange, something passed between us that felt like covenant, like the sealing of an understanding that would outlive my ability to articulate it. Then, with a grace that seemed impossible for something so massive, the creature turned and began walking back toward the tree line, its enormous footfalls barely disturbing the fresh snow that now fell in thick curtains around us. I wanted to call out, to ask it to stay just a moment longer, to offer some inadequate human words of gratitude for what it had given me. But my voice had abandoned me entirely, and perhaps that silence was more appropriate than anything I could have said. The boundary between human language and the communication we'd shared felt too vast to bridge with ordinary speech, and I understood that some exchanges happened in spaces where words became obstacles rather than tools. As it reached the edge of the clearing where the ancient pines stood sentinel, the Yeti paused and turned its massive head to look back at me one final time, and in that gesture I felt everything. Acknowledgement of what we'd shared, warning about the responsibility I now carried, and something that felt impossibly like blessing, as if this guardian of thresholds was granting me permission to return to my world forever changed. The amber eyes that had reflected such ancient intelligence now seemed to hold a question, asking if I understood what had been entrusted to me, and I found myself nodding through tears that had frozen on my cheeks, accepting a burden I couldn't name but recognized in my bones. The creature released one final vocalization, softer than before, a sound that resonated through the clearing like a grandfather's benediction, and then it simply stepped between two massive pines and vanished as if the forest had opened to receive it and closed again behind its passage. I stared at the spot where it had disappeared, half expecting it to reappear and prove this was real, not hallucination or desperate projection of my grief-shattered mind, but the tree line remained still, except for the falling snow. that now descended in earnest, covering everything in white silence. My camera was still recording on its tripod, where I'd left it positioned to capture the sunset, and the rational part of my brain registered that I had evidence that whatever I'd experienced had been documented by technology that didn't lie or imagine or need things to be true. But even as that thought formed, I knew the footage would show only shadows and distance, shapes that could be explained away by anyone determined to preserve their understanding of what was possible, and the real proof wasn't something that could be captured by lens and sensor. What happened here tonight lived in my chest, where that resonant call had vibrated through my ribs and into the cavity that held my heart, had been written into my body in ways that transcended documentation, and I would carry it forward not as story to be shared, but as knowledge to be honored. The snow fell heavier now, large flakes that landed on the ice where both our hands had pressed, already beginning the work of erasure that would leave no physical evidence of this encounter, except my own transformed understanding. I stood slowly, my legs trembling from cold and emotion and the sheer magnitude of what I'd witnessed, and looked down at the frozen lake where my handprint was already filling with snow, beside the much larger impression left by the Yetis. A palm. In a few hours, both would be completely covered, the ice returning to its pristine surface as if neither of us had ever knelt here in communion with grief and mystery and the thin places where worlds touch. But the mountains would remember, I understood now, the way my father had always insisted they did, holding every moment of significance in their ancient consciousness, and this lake would forever be marked in ways that had nothing to do with physical evidence. I thought of my father's journals that I'd read obsessively after his death, searching for some message he'd left specifically for me, some final wisdom that would help me navigate the world without him, and I realized now that he'd been preparing me all along with stories I'd dismissed as metaphor. Every tale of the old ones who walked between worlds, every insistence that the mountains were sacred, not symbolically, but literally, every piece of indigenous wisdom he'd tried to pass on, despite my educated skepticism, all of it had been leading me here, to this moment, to this encounter that would finally open my eyes to what he'd spent his life trying to show me. The gift he'd left wasn't in any journal entry or final conversation, but in the path he'd laid that would eventually lead me to this clearing, where a guardian older than human memory would teach me what my father's words couldn't convey. I retrieved my camera with hands that shook violently now from cold and adrenaline crash, and as I packed my gear, I understood with perfect clarity that I would return home transformed in ways that would be invisible to everyone, except perhaps those who had experienced their own encounters with mystery they couldn't name. The footage would show ambiguous shapes that believers would embrace and skeptics would dismiss, and I would learn to live with the loneliness of carrying truth that couldn't be adequately shared, would join the quiet ranks of those who had touched something beyond explanation, and return to find the language of ordinary life suddenly insufficient. But I would also carry forward a relationship with my father's absence that was no longer a wound requiring healing, but a connection requiring honoring, would understand that grief, this profound, was evidence of love that transcended the physical boundaries of life and death. As I shouldered my pack and took one final look at the clearing where the Yeti had stood, snow now falling so heavily that the tree line had become a grey suggestion in the darkness, I felt something in my chest that had been clenched tight since my father's death finally begin to loosen. The mountains had given me what I came seeking without knowing what I needed, and as I turned toward my tent and the long journey home, I carried with me not answers, but something infinitely more valuable, the understanding that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but honored, and that grief, like the ancient guardian who had blessed me with its presence, is both terrifying and sacred, both burden and privilege, both ending and transformation into something we lack the vocabulary to name. The drive back to Seattle took me through mountain passes I'd traveled dozens of times before, But now, the landscape seemed fundamentally altered, as if my encounter had adjusted the lens through which I perceived everything, revealing dimensions that had always existed but remained invisible to my previous way of seeing. I kept glancing at the camera bag on my passenger seat, knowing what the footage would show. Distant shapes between trees that could be anything, movement that skeptics would attribute to shadow play or equipment malfunction, sounds that acoustics experts would explain away with wind patterns and temperature inversions. But I also knew with unshakable certainty what I had witnessed, what had passed between myself and that ancient guardian in a clearing where grief became communion rather than isolation. And I understood finally why my father had always returned from the mountains, with something in his eyes that he couldn't translate into words for those of us who hadn't made the journey ourselves. Isao, snow-covered peaks in my rearview mirror, seemed to watch my departure the way the Yeti had watched me, with patient awareness that I was carrying something forward that would change how I moved through the remainder of my life, whether or not I could ever adequately explain it to another human being. I thought about the journal I'd found at the abandoned camp, those frantic sketches, and the final terrified entry, and I wondered if that person had fled before the real encounter could happen, had let fear override the invitation that was being extended, and I felt profound gratitude that something in my grief-hollowed state had kept me present long enough to receive what was being offered. My apartment felt impossibly small and artificial after 9 days in the wilderness, the walls too close and the air too still, and every surface covered with objects that suddenly seemed like elaborate distractions from the fundamental questions my encounter had forced me to confront. I uploaded the footage to my computer that first night home, watching it over and over with the obsessive attention of someone searching for evidence that would convince others of what I knew to be true. But the camera had captured exactly what I expected: ambiguous shapes and distant movement that could be interpreted 1,000 different ways, depending on what the viewer needed to believe. In one frame, I could clearly see the massive silhouette standing among the pines, and in the audio, I could hear that deep, resonant call that had vibrated through my chest. But I knew from the comments on similar videos I dismissed in the past exactly what responses these images would generate. The believers would see confirmation of what they already accepted. The skeptics would see proof of nothing except human desperation to find meaning in random patterns, and the vast majority would scroll past without engaging at all, immune to mystery in an age that demanded everything be immediately explainable or instantly dismissible. But as I sat in the blue glow of my monitor, headphones carrying that haunting vocalization directly into my ears, I realized I didn't need anyone else to validate what had happened in that clearing beside the frozen lake. The truth of it was written into my body and memory in ways that transcended the need for external confirmation. The weeks that followed my return brought the inevitable questions from friends and colleagues who noticed something different about me, some fundamental shift they couldn't quite identify, but sensed in the way I now moved through conversations and obligations that had once seemed important, but now felt like performances in a play I no longer believed in. I told them the acceptable version, that I'd gone hiking to process my father's death, that the solitude had been healing, that I'd come to some peace with his absence, and I watched their relieved expressions as they accepted this explanation that fit comfortably within their understanding of how grief and nature were supposed to work. Only my father's oldest friend, an elder from the tribe who had taught him the stories I'd dismissed as cultural mythology, looked at me with recognition when I mentioned where I'd been hiking, and in his knowing silence I understood that he had experienced his own encounter with the guardians who walked the boundary places. We sat together in his small house, filled with the smell of cedar and sweetgrass, and he told me stories that I finally heard with different ears about the responsibilities that came with being witnessed by the ancient ones, about the isolation of carrying truth that couldn't be shared with those who hadn't earned it through their own trials, and about the gift my father had given me by planting seeds that would only germinate when I was ready to understand what they contained. He explained that the Yeti, the Sasquatch, the names were human attempts to contain something that existed outside our taxonomies and explanations, guardians of thresholds who appeared to those standing at the edge of transformation, and that my father had known I would need to meet one when grief finally broke me open enough to see what had always been there. I keep the footage on an encrypted drive, and I've shown it to exactly 3 people, each of them someone I knew would understand, that the blurry images were only artifacts of an experience that happened in dimensions cameras cannot capture, and I've learned to live with the loneliness of carrying knowledge that isolates as much as it illuminates. But I've also discovered a community of others who've had their own encounters with mystery, not just the Yeti, but other ancient presences that still walk the forgotten places. And in their company, I feel less alone with my transformed understanding of what the world contains beneath its surface explanations. I visit my father's grave now with different words, thanking him for the inheritance he left that was so much more valuable than anything material, for the path he marked that led me to that clearing where grief became initiation rather than ending. And every few months I return to the mountains, hiking to that frozen lake, where I once pressed my hand against ice beside a creature that shouldn't exist, according to everything I'd been taught. And I sit in silence among those ancient pines, honoring the mystery that chose me, carrying forward the responsibility of knowing that some boundaries are meant to remain permeable, that some grief opens doors rather than closing them, and that the world is so much stranger and more sacred than we allow ourselves to believe until something breaks us open enough to finally see what our ancestors always knew was there, waiting in the liminal spaces where the veil grows thin and the old ones still walk, teaching those willing to learn that transformation and terror and transcendence are 3 names for the same threshold we must all eventually cross. What truth are you carrying that the world isn't ready to understand? Subscribe for more encounters with the mysteries that walk beside us unseen.